Okay, well, real good. Thanks for having me on tonight, you guys. And like I said, any questions, feel free to jump in and we'll make it interactive. We have a nice sized group for that. So, and I just kind of hope by the end of this evening, I can at least elevate your game a little bit and give you some knowledge going to the stream, this next season. So feel free to take notes and let's go. So, I think all of us, especially with those with kids and grandkids, know that when you're young, you love bugs and they're fun. And as you get older, you develop an aversion to them, unfortunately, until you get into fly fishing. And then instead of swatting bugs and running away, you're trying to catch bugs and have a look at them and then try to identify them and then see if you have an artificial fly in your fly box to imitate them. So our attitudes change quite a bit as we get into this field. My love for fly fishing grew, I found myself as the aquatic biologist in the group teaching the entomology section of any workshop that we did. And I discovered there was a real lack of knowledge in no fault to anyone, it's just the way we learn in school and so forth. And I really became very excited about teaching entomology to fly fishers. This goes back to probably 2008 or 9. A publisher came to me and they had published a few other hatch guides, one for Western streams, one for Eastern streams, and they were looking for someone to do one on the Midwest. And long story short, I said yes, and began quite an adventure, an endeavor into the aquatic world. I discovered that photographing, there was a huge research end to this project, but the photography end was a bit of a challenge. And photographing the immature stage of an insect was, relatively manageable. I mean, for sure they wiggle around, but there are little tricks to get them to slow down and get their picture taken. But I found that the adult stage was quite a challenge. And at the time, my kids were in school and I was, running them from dance to band to, all sorts of different endeavors. And I would go to the stream during the day and I'd bring my bugs home. And when I brought them back to my photo studio to take their picture, a lot of times they had expired. And I became really kind of panicked in that no matter how artfully you posed an insect without a body part, or maybe you had left it in the freezer too long, or the car at 100 degrees too long, I didn't have a publishable photo. And I had a little panic moment. But in grad school, I had some different colleagues with other expertises, and I connected with one of them, and we talked about, putting together an artificial stream. And I came up with this little, whatever you want to call it, invention in my home. And what you're looking at here is a pretty large tank, and I've got a recirculating pump with eaves troughs and river water, and I inoculated these eaves troughs, AKA river bottoms, with bits of material from, natural streams, whether it was cobble or decaying wood, larger bits of stone. And then I added select nymphs and larvae from 2 or 3 different species, and raised them, and kept the temperature fairly stable, and oxygenated them. And they turned out to be pretty wildly successful. And I was able to then collect adults pretty much in the comfort of my home. So I hoofed it out to rivers all around the Midwest, came back, raised these insects, and then was able to kind of reach up under this netting that I had put over the tops of them, and get perfect adults, which then I could take into my photo studio and get really quite lovely pictures from them. Also able to, because I could get multiple numbers of any one species, I could, for some of these mayflies in particular, males and females have different colors, and especially with some of the mayflies, especially the clingers, which have never really been raised out, and from nymph to adult, really shown. I was able to do that. So at any one time I had upwards of, I think at the most I had maybe 25 different tanks going at once. And I'm happy to say I'm still married, and my husband stuck with me through all of this. The kids had quite a field day with bringing their friends over, who all really thought I had some sort of meth lab going at the time, but not true. And the end result was this hatch guide, which I'm sure many of you have there. It has since gone out of print, unfortunately. And I don't have all the reasoning for that, but the good news is I'm republishing it. It'll probably be under a little bit different, well, for sure under a different publisher, and a little bit different name, and I will share that with you in next year when I have that information. But at this point, I'm pretty sure I'm going to publish with Stackpole. So anyways, I'm also going to add, if you already have that guide, I'm going to add a section on terrestrials. So there'll be some new information, and I potentially am looking at adding some additional flies to the older section. Okay, so that's just a little background on how I wrote this guide. Going forward, we get to we're at this stage in our lives, and I don't know how many beginners you have in your club, but you can all remember back to when you had a single fly rod and maybe one fly box, and the world was an open book when it came to fly fishing. But if you're like me and you're at this stage in your life, you have more than one fly box that looks like this. This is your staging box, and then you take all these things and you put them into smaller boxes and you go to the river. But so often we get to the river and then we stare at that fly box and it's like, what do I do? I don't see anything on the river. What should I do? And I'd like to try to get your thinking to being prepared when you go to the river, and in any section of a river, in any place in the country at any time of the year, so that you just don't randomly pull flies from a fly box and then go to the river and then be stuck like this. So as you look at this little series of slides, I want you to look at how the river changes, and look at the current, look at how light is penetrating these sections of the water. Here's a slow, lazy pool, a faster riffly area, certainly more shallow, probably more oxygen, a section of river with all, heavy gravel. If I zoom in there, if you look closely, you can actually see caddisflies all lined up and down on the downside stream of these bits of cobble. A completely woodland type stream, heavily vegetated, lots of decaying wood. And the question I pose to you is, if you were to go to any one section of this river and open a hatch guide, can you find all of those insects in any one of these sections? And when you think about it, it's like, well, probably not. And of course, the answer is, of course not, you can't. It's a little bit like if you had a bird guide and you open that bird guide and you go outside and you're like, well, what birds are out here? It's very determined by a number of variables. And I would like to look at some of those variables as we proceed this evening. So let's think about, what determines insect hatches? What kind of variables go into that? So first and foremost, those of you that have fished out west or out east or southwest, that as you travel to different geographical regions, you will have some different hatches. If you are, somewhat savvy with your hatches, there are behavioral traits as you go from Midwest to West or to East. We do have some overlap, but we also have some hatches that are definitely unique to a certain geographical section of the country. Phenology is an important variable, and it's a kind of a fancy word. We don't really use it in everyday life, but we're familiar with it. And phenology just means the natural order of things as they occur. And I like to make the analogy to your own garden flowers, for example. So in the first to hatch out in the season, like when we think early March, maybe even sometimes late February, we have crocuses will be our first blooming wildflowers, or our blooming garden flowers. And then the next step might be daffodils after that, followed by tulips, followed by irises, followed by lilies. And that order never changes from year to year. Every year we know exactly the bloom order of things. Now the timing of that can change. So if we have a very mild season, maybe the crocuses will begin blooming sooner, or if it's very harsh winter, they'll come later. So it's almost like a train, with all the cars in order, and the order of the cars never change, but it can go a little ahead of schedule or a little behind. And fortunately, our insect hatches are very much the same way. So that helps us. We can go to a hatch chart and say, okay, it is May. I can go to this geographical section of the country and know for sure that, maybe 4 or 5 different hatches are to be expected. So that's a very beneficial variable that works to our advantage. Now, one thing, a variable that most fly anglers, I think, completely overlook is habitat. And I already alluded to this a little bit in showing you those series of slides. So let's do another analogy. So when you think about birds, and some of you are probably bird hunters, if you were to go, this is a really obvious one, if you're going to go hunt ducks obviously you'd have to go to a pond. You would not go to a forest, so if you were going to hunt turkey, you wouldn't go to a pond. You would have to go to a woodland area and maybe even an open field. So there's a little overlap in that habitat. If you're hunting for pheasant or just even, whatever you're looking for, any kind of bird watching, you have a little idea of the habitat of that species. And the same is true for any of our insects. They're very particular about the habitat in which they can reside. And so some of our insects are very specific in preferring tailwaters, and maybe they like all of that churned up food, and they have ways of staining that food just below a dam, and that benefits them. Other types of insects have to have very cold, oxygenated, highly oxygenated water in which to survive. Others, have to have that gravelly type habitat. Still others, prefer decaying wood. And so the more that you understand about a hatch, and when you go out to pursue it, the more success you'll find in your fly fishing. And then lastly, of course, time of day. Once you have focused on the first three variables, time of day is important in determining a hatch. We know that some insects are going to hatch early morning, some midday, some others in the middle of the night or late in the evening. And that's important. If you're going to, go fish the hexagenia hatch, you wouldn't go out for a spinner hatch at noon, for example. And obviously that's an obvious one, but each one of our different hatches have some of these different variables that you need to focus on. Okay, so thinking of these things, I want to just review the mayfly life cycle. And all of us, go back to third grade and we learn one insect life cycle in school, and that's the monarch butterfly. And we know that the monarch the butterfly lays her eggs, they hatch into a caterpillar, which, lives all summer long and then spins a cocoon or a chrysalis and pupates in there, undergoes a big metamorphosis, big radical change, and then out comes the butterfly. But if I asked you what is the life cycle of a grasshopper, it might take you back for a minute, and you might say, well, I don't know. Grasshoppers don't have a complete metamorphosis like a butterfly or a moth does. Instead, they have an incomplete metamorphosis. And so when the female lays her eggs, those eggs hatch into really just a little miniature grasshopper, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then as an adult, it just adds wings. And then that's how it changes through its life. And in a way, the mayfly is somewhat similar to that. It doesn't have a big radical change. And so we say that it has an incomplete metamorphosis. Anything that has an incomplete metamorphosis, we call the immature stage a nymph. So when you go to a fly shop and you see there are nymphs and then there are larvae, the larvae refer to any of the insects, usually, caddisfly, as insects with a complete metamorphosis. So it's just kind of fun to be like, oh, why do we have nymphs? Why do we have larvae? And that's why. But let's just kind of look at, I know some of you are familiar with this life cycle. Maybe there's some new members here, and I'll review that now for you. The mayfly female will lay her eggs in the water, and those nymphs, and just know, let me just say this now, that everything that I say there's going to be an exemption to the rule. So if I say it takes a year to grow, yeah, there's going to be some species in here that only take three months, for example. So just throwing that out there. I'll say things and you'll be like, yeah, but what about this? So feel free to ask me any of that as I go along. So the female will lay her eggs, and she will lay thousands of eggs, and they will begin to grow and develop. And over the course of a year, they might change. As they grow, they molt. And so each time they molt, they look a little bit different, a little more developed. And, right before they're getting ready to emerge, all of those eggs are the same age. And so, thousands of these nymphs will begin to emerge at once, which is great. That's what gets fish super excited, and which gets us as anglers super excited. So those nymphs, the fully developed nymphs, will swim to the surface, and they just pretty much split along the thorax region. And the first kind of what we call a subadult or a dun will pop out of there, and it will have wings. It looks not unlike the nymph, except that it has wings. And then that will fly away to surrounding vegetation and sort of rest for a short while. And then it will molt one more time. And that typically that happens after, 24 to 48 hours, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little less. The final stage, the adult, is the reproductive stage, and we call that the spinner. And it looks a little bit different, and we'll look at some of those differences in a moment. But then all those adults will come together, and the males will gather first in a big swarm, and they will emit pheromones, and oftentimes as a swarm, they'll fly up and down in hopes to attract females. And the females will fly into the swarm, and then hopefully mating will ensue. And then the female will return to the river and lay her eggs. And I think we have a question.
And yes, we do. Joe Gow asked, what does molt? What does it mean to molt? What's the meaning of molt?
Great question. So anything, when you think about, people, we just grow and, change internally, but things that have any kind of a hard exoskeleton, as they grow and change, it's like a piece of plastic, and things will change internally. And then in order to get to the next stage, they have to split out of a shuck. So with a nymph, with a mayfly, for example, depending on the species, they might molt 30 different times before they get to the adult stage. So when you think of the egg and, being almost at a microscopic, probably some of them, for some of the really tiny mayflies, they are almost microscopic. And when the first nymphs are born, they're very, very small. But then, then we can see them with the naked eye as they grow and develop. And so every time they molt, I think about a crayfish, they do the same thing. Every time they get a little bit bigger, they have to split out of that exoskeleton, and we call that molting. Okay, good question. So the female then lays her eggs, and then the life cycle is completed. So oftentimes the males, sometimes they fly away, sometimes they mate again. A lot can happen, but for sure the females, in order to be successful, have to return to the river and lay their eggs. So each one of these different life cycle stages you can imitate with an artificial fly. in certain species, we find in certain different hatches, sometimes the dun stage is more important to fish. Sometimes the spinner stage is more important, the egg layer. Sometimes, the nymphs can be important year round, but I'm going to show you something about nymphs and a little bit on the best ways to fish them. It's not as though nymphs are just swimming, all over the place in the river. I mean, they really hang down into their substrate until right before an emergence. So I'll come back to that. So anything mayfly nymph typically has 3 tails, everything except maybe one species that I can think of. And they have gills on their abdomen. So, and that separates them from some other groups. A mayfly dun is characterized by 2 pair of upright wings, and they don't have any mouth parts at all as adults. So the adults are very short-lived. They can't feed, so they really only live, anywhere from a couple of days to, at most maybe 4 days in some of the bigger mayflies. So they have to have all of their energy stored for their life as an adult to reproduce, going forward. Now, remember I said that the nymphs had 3 tails. As adults, some mayflies have 3 tails, but some only have 2. And that middle tail is sometimes vestigial or non-functional. And we have whole different groups of mayflies that have 2 tails as adults. And when I first started learning all this, I really struggled with it. And I have another program that kind of helps you to separate out, who has 2 tails, who has 3 tails, and, different things about their wings. But I'm not going to get focused on that this evening. But that's one of the things that you have to work on when you're learning mayfly hatches. Also, one other thing. So as a dun, they're very, very dull in color. And if you look at this slide, hopefully you have, this is coming through good in your computer screen. You can actually see little tiny hairs all over the body, and it shows up especially well on the wing there, especially the front wing. You can see little bitty hairs, and those little hairs help to repel water. So when the dun is emerging, it's important that it doesn't take on water so that it can fly away and escape. In the spinner stage, they don't have that, and as a result, in the spinner stage, they're very clear and brightly colored. They've molted one more time, and the colors tend to be more brilliant. The wings are clear. The spinners have see-through wings, as it were. And then a couple things with, that complicates things. I always thought males and females are often look different. For sure, all of the males have very large eyes, sometimes really big and red, sometimes big and green or orange. But you can always, sometimes people would come up to me in a river and say, well, I just saw this mayfly with these huge orange eyes. And it's like, well, all I can say is it's a male, that's all I really know from that description. But they need those large eyes to be able to see the female in the cloud as they're trying to mate with them. Also, during that molt from the dun to the spinner, the males get extremely long legs, and they need the long front legs, just the front legs. I didn't mean all their legs. The front legs become very long because they have to reach up and grab the female in the swarm in order to mate with her. And presumably then the tails are very long to kind of balance that out so that they're still able to fly. So they get long front legs and very long tails just in the males. So this is what it looks like when a nymph emerges into the dun stage. You can see that it just sort of splits along the thorax or right up between the, kind of between, like, think of where our shoulder blades are. This is what it looks like when the dun molts into the spinner stage. This is something that we don't necessarily see, because sometimes it's, it typically happens away from the river. If you have a river house, you may have watched this, as they cling to the side of your cabin. But otherwise it's happening in the vegetation nearby a stream. But if everything goes well, the spinner emerges and then is ready to reproduce from there. Okay, now with mayflies, remember I said they all had 3 tails and they had gills on their abdomen. And if you look at this slide, you can see, okay, everything here has 3 tails. And everything has, well, it looks like there are gills on all the abdomen. So these are actually all mayfly nymphs, even though they don't look anything alike. And this kind of comes back to habitat. And remember I said, there are multitude of habitats for all insects, but in this case, I'm choosing mayflies. We have some mayflies that have unique habitats. And somebody a while back kind of named all of these habitats: clingers, crawlers, swimmers, and burrowers. And so you can look at all of these different little niches and then learn a lot about what the adults look like. And that's a different program, but I want to kind of focus on just one of these groups for now. But if you look at each of these different habitats, a clinger, for example, you can go all over the country and fish patterns like this. And some of you, I'm sure, have done some entomology workshops with beginner students and found when you pick clingers off a habitat, it's all you can do to pry them off. They're perfectly flattened and sucked on, oftentimes to a pretty good size piece of rock. And they're adapted to live in very fast currents. So even when the currents increase, they're not swept away, and their mouth parts are underneath, and they just sort of graze along on diatoms and algae and bits of detritus. And they, are capable of living in nice, fast habitats as a result. Crawlers, on the other hand, are a little more robust. If you look at them head on, they're more round, more spindly legs, and they crawl around in gravel, just feeding on detritus, which is just bits of decaying matter in a stream. Burrowers, if you look at them, you look at their front legs and even their head, they've got tusks there, and their front legs, like they're almost like hands, and they're like little shovels, and it enables them to dig burrows like a little tube and live in that in the sediments. Their gills typically are more filamentous and feathery, so they can get more oxygen and kind of draw water through there, keeping it well oxygenated, and even drawing a little bit of food in there as they live. And then the last group, the swimmers, if you watch them, I mean, when you first see them, they almost look like a small minnow as it's swimming in your little pan, and they act very much like a little minnow. There are a few different mayfly groups that are imitated by this, and in each of these different nymphs, live in different habitats, and you can learn a lot about each of these, and how to best fish them, and depending on the habitat you're fishing in. So I'm going to pick one of these. I've picked one of these. I've picked crawlers. There are lots of these here in the Midwest, everything in the Hendrickson group and the sulfurs, and a few others are in this group. They tend to be very camouflaged as nymphs, kind of spindly legs. Their gills, because they're in that gravel, they're like little plates, almost like somebody clapping their hand right on top there. And those are the gills are under those little plates, and keeps the sediment away from the gills as they're respiring. So I said that, as far as nymphs are concerned and how to fish them, you don't find, if you think of, go back to that mayfly life cycle, and the female had laid thousands of eggs. And a lot of times I think as anglers, we think that, oh, you can always fish a nymph, because there are nymphs in the water all the time. Well, it's true to a degree, but where are the nymphs? And that's what you need to think about when you're fishing a nymph. So all of these crawler mayflies, they can't just be swimming up and down in the water column. And when I say water column, I mean from the bottom of the water substrate up to the water surface. They're not just swimming up and down in there, or, that would just, be like feeding birds in a park, throwing crumbs out there. They would all be eaten. So in order for these crawler type mayflies to survive, they have to really stay submerged down in that substrate until right before they're ready to emerge, and then they become active and start beginning to swim around. Number two, sometimes, well, actually, lots of scientific research has gone on the phenology called drift, or the phenomenon called drift. And that is a natural occurrence whereby insects naturally just sort of let go of wherever they're living. So, maybe there's a predator there, or maybe the food is diminished, or, other reasons. But insects will drift, and they typically do this at two different times of the day. One is right at dusk, kind of midnight time. Well, actually, really more than dusk, midnight. And then right at dawn, and there's another smaller pulse at like 2 a.m. But insects will move, and they're finding new territories, and fish will feed on nymphs, especially during those different times of the days. And then lastly, you'll find nymphs, distributed in the water column if there's a disturbance like a flood. So then, everybody gets washed out of their habitat and is swirling around, and then you will find nymphs distributed in the water column. But otherwise, they're hanging tight in their substrate and feeding there. And if you are fishing a nymph, you've got to get the nymph down into that habitat. And so oftentimes we're using bead heads, getting them down on the bottom, really right on the bottom substrate, in order to be successful. So, well, I got ahead of myself a little bit on this screen, but so, with bead heads, you've got to get them down and put that mend in there to allow the bead head to get down and then move naturally, so that fish see that as a nymph moving, on its own, not dragging or anything. So here's that nymph that we looked at before. It was indeed a Hendrickson nymph. Everything in that crawler type group as an adult, turns out, has 3 tails as an adult. They have plain wings. Also in this group, which I also found very frustrating when I started fly fishing, males and females can be very different color wise. So it's kind of like, when you learn birds and you see a red cardinal, which is like, fairly easy to identify, but then can you identify the female? It's like, well, when you see them together, it seems kind of obvious. The profile is the same. And the same is true with male and female Hendrickson, and you begin to recognize that. You look at their wing shape, that the male is sort of reddish. And of course, before I even put male up here, you probably recognize that as a male because of the big giant eyes. Here's the female. You can see with her eyes, obviously they're much diminished. In fact, you got to kind of look hard to even see them. But the wings are of similar shape and venation, which, I'm not going to ask you to try to learn that. That's something that taxonomists get into, and counting all the little veins and so forth. But let me just go back to that slide. So if you look at the hind wing and you kind of see almost a little bump in that, you can then see that in the female as well. And so, they look similar, but the females are kind of a more browny olivey color. If you look at them in black and white, you can see, for sure the profile looks very much similar. I know that's hard when you're first getting started and learning hatches, but fortunately males and females are on the river at the same time, and that's helpful, when you collect them and kind of look at them and get to see those differences. Now, one thing that's also another one of these things that I struggled with when I started fly fishing is you would see these hook size numbers out there, and you'd see Hendrickson size 12 to 14. And I remember when I started tying, it's like, well, what does that mean? Is that like a range, and they can go from this big to this small? And well, the answer is no. The bigger hook size range refers to the female, and the females have bigger bodies, typically bigger abdomens, because they're full of eggs. And the males are just a little bit smaller. And that's true in the insect world in general, and definitely true in all of our aquatic entomology. So, does it matter? Well, of course, sometimes it does, and if you're the owner of a fly shop, you're going to say, yeah, you should probably have some males and you should have some females. And, you could argue with them and say, well, I think they're just trying to sell me some flies. But here's what actually happens biologically. So if you had a clutch of eggs, and in other words, those eggs that the female laid back at the very beginning, and all of those are developing, and you get all the way a year down the road, and the first ones that start to hatch are the males. And the males might hatch for 2 or 3 days out of that one clutch before the females start to hatch out. So in any one hatch, in any one clutch of insects, or in a river, if you could isolate them, the first to hatch out are the males. So sometimes fish will fixate on the smaller individual in a hatch, and especially in this case, Hendrickson's, the males are that reddish color, and sometimes they will fixate on that until the bigger females come out, and then they might start eating back and forth, and then they're eating all of them. But with some of these hatches where you have obvious color differences, I carry both sizes with, these different patterns just in case. Personally, with Hendrickson's, the fish haven't started to really get picky yet. It's the first of the year, and it takes them a while before they even start to come up and surface feed. But whenever I'm stumped on a river, I always drop down a size in a fly, drop a tippet size and drop a fly size, and oftentimes that's enough to make the fish more comfortable to feed. So any questions on that? So then of course in the spinner stage, remember I said that the males get super long tails, super long legs, and those of you that are tyers, I know we're all trained to make the tails the same as the abdomen. And I think probably in our spinner patterns, we tend to tie those tails a bit short. Don't be afraid to add a little length to those. And then with the females, I try to, when I tie anyway, I incorporate the egg color. And in my book, I try to, I think in most of my patterns, not all of them, but as many as I try to always let you know what the color of the egg sac was so that you could incorporate that into a pattern. And when you see those Hendrickson's, the females flying on a river, she will fly with those, at least in the ephemerellas or the crawler groups. They'll hang their eggs right out like that. So it's almost like a little lantern as they're flying on the river. And she's going to try to come down to the river and really just release that whole egg sac. Other insects will try to eclose just a portion of their eggs at a time, and they'll go up and down on the river more than once. So in tying, here's some male and some female patterns. The male there in the front, and some other patterns tied with the egg sac right there intact.
So the eggs always sink?
Yes, they do sink. Good question.
And don't we know that spinner pattern is a red quill?
Well, yes. There's so many common names for Hendrickson's. There's probably 8 to 10 different names. So it's very local. And so it's frustrating, I think, to when you're learning hatches to hear. You can travel around the Midwest, and every little locale will have different names for Hendrickson. So in my book, I tried to name as many of those as I could come up with. But if, it's like, okay, if we can all learn those common names, it'd be good if you could kind of just pick up the Latin, ephemerella, subvaria, and then it's like, oh yeah, that's Hendrickson, blah, blah, blah. And then y'all are on the same page as far as talking to each other about what's on the water. So here's just a little video. These are going to be some Hendrickson nymphs in a tank, and they're just prior to hatching. And so in my tank, I've got some wood in there, and they're up on there. Now, typically they would be on more gravelly material. But that little kind of, they call that like a scorpion behavior there, where they put their tail up and back. And that's actually kind of a little defensive posturing. And why it was doing that. It might not have liked me looking at it and filming it. I don't know. There were a lot of other nymphs in there as well, but they become very active right before they're starting to hatch. Here's a couple of Hendrickson nymphs, and you can see the profile of them. They're pretty chunky, and there is their swimming behavior. Just so they sort of start swimming a little bit, becoming slightly active right before they begin to, right prior to a hatch. Here's one. Those of you that are familiar with Kelly Gallup and his work, in some of his books, he termed these stillborns, and some of the population will come up to the water surface, and for whatever reason they are unable to break through that meniscus, and they just sit there, and so they're very, very easy pickings for fish, whether their body just doesn't pop open or who knows exactly physiologically what happens, but they're easily picked off and eaten. Sometimes everything works out though.
Mute your speaker or increase volume. You have your volume way up.
I think somebody is not on mute here. But okay, so you can see how quickly that happens, and you can see the shuck as that falls below, and the dun is now ready to take off. That shuck that falls down, there's really no food value to that, although there have been some studies that show that, especially with hatchery fish, they will, feed on that, but eventually learn that there's, really no nutrient value to that. Here's a Hendrickson that has reached the surface and is ready to take off, and you can tell that that's a male just by looking at the eyes. And look down in your lower left, and you'll see another nymph coming, and just how quickly that happens. So you can see right there in the thorax region, or if we look at our own bodies, kind of right between the shoulder blades. I'm going to show you that again, and how quickly it happens. And so the takeaway of that is, when you think of in a section where there could be hundreds to thousands of mayflies emerging all at once, if you don't have the right fly on, and you've got to cut that off, find the right fly in your fly box, tie it on, imagine the amount of time right there. I mean, does that take you 10 minutes? Does that take you 2 minutes? So the point I kind of like to drive home here, number one, make sure your knot skills are spot on. Practice those before you go to the river. Number two, make sure your fly box is well organized. And the way I organize my fly box is by season. And so I've got an April-May box, and then a May-June, and then June-July, and so on. Not including my streamer stuff. That's just for hatches. And so, I know, boom, right exactly where my Hendricksons are, and my duns and my spinners and so far. So just important to be organized so that you don't waste time on the river. So some mayflies might get to the surface and hatch, but maybe not everything pops out. And so what you just saw there is what Kelly Gallup called a cripple. And so you can see that hind wing is, it's never gonna, this thing I watched for hours, and it never ever got past this. Nothing for whatever reason, the wings were not ever going to open. So again, I know all of you have probably been on the river where these, they're just at the mercy of the currents, and they can oftentimes collect in a little backwater, and fish will sit back there and just pick them off. And it seems like they're always in a spot where it's almost impossible to get a good cast in there. It's back in a little eddy, and so easy pickings for fish. So let's apply some of that to your fishing, and think about, what it is the fish are feeding on. And if you think about, look at the fish rise form, and try to be very analytical here. So if you see just a bulge under the water where you see the water kind of, gurgle up there, and there's no break in the surface, a fish is feeding completely underneath, right near the surface. It's eating a nymph or an emerger, maybe even a stillborn, but probably a nymph or an emerger. If the dorsal fin and tail come up and of the fish, it's probably eating an emerger. So you just see that much breakthrough. If you see the fish come right up and out, it's likely eating an emerger or done stage. And the easiest thing to read on the river, I think, is a spinner form or spinner feed. And that's when you just see the lips, and they have all day to feed on those, and that's easy read. I didn't show you a spinner feed there, but I know you've all seen that. All right, any questions there? Doing good?
We did have one question. Are fish ever known to eat the insects' eggs that they've laid?
That's a great question. And there have been some studies to that effect. A lot of the eggs get down and kind of, mired into the sediments right away. Some eggs might be eaten. And the studies that I have read, the eggs will pass through a fish's gut unharmed. And so, when the fish in the fish excrement, they come back out, and they're just fine. So it's kind of a neat thing.
That's good.
Also, I could go down a rabbit hole there, but when an egg is laid, in some species, they start to grow right away. And then in some others, so for example, in brown drakes, they start to grow right away, and then their development might slow down later on in the season. With things like gray drakes, they don't begin to grow until they're laid in June or so, and they don't grow. They stay dormant in the egg stage, and they don't really begin to grow until January, and they have rapid growth and through the winter. So that's pretty interesting. So let's then think back on the variables that I posted at the beginning, geography, phenology, habitat, time of day. And you could apply that to every hatch that you fish. So Hendrickson's, geographically, we're only going to find them in eastern US, so east of the Mississippi. So you can fish them Midwest, or you can fish them out east. They're going to occur phenology wise, end of April, early May, so right around opening day. Pattern sizes, I touched on a little bit, size 12 to 14, with the bigger size being the female. Time of day, the duns will hatch mid to late afternoon, with the spinners coming into early evening. And Bob, probably most importantly, if you're going to, try to fish the Hendrickson hatch, you have to go to a river or stream that has that gravelly habitat in order to find them. Here's a little commercial break. I love this little thing. It's called a quick seine. Some of you might have it. It's really just a little cheap net product. You could make one if you're handy. Go to Joann Fabrics, but you have this little netting material with a little bit of elastic on it, and it goes right over your net. And so sometimes, we're all stumped on the river, and it's like, I don't see anything. I don't know what's out there. And you put your net out there in the film, half submerged, half above, and after 5 minutes or so, you can bring that in and see what's in the film, and hopefully I either identify the insect or at least say, well, shoot, I don't know what it is, but I've got a fly that's, about a size 14 or 16. I'm going to put that on and see how I do. So nice little crutch, as it were. Okay, well, let's shift gears now to stoneflies. And it's another life cycle that's not as complicated as mayflies, but has an incomplete metamorphosis. So that means it doesn't have any sort of cocoon stage at all. The female will lay her eggs, and again, over the course of about a year, they will grow and molt. A lot of times, upwards of 20 plus times before they're fully developed. And instead of swimming to the surface to emerge, they must crawl out on an object. So many of them crawl out on stones. Some of them crawl out to emergent vegetation. Some of them will crawl out on logs that are sticking out into a river. And whatever it takes, they have to crawl out and then split out of that old shock, and the winged adult will come out of there. Oftentimes, so the mayflies had these big, fancy swarms where the males gathered and emitted pheromones, and the females were drawn in. With stoneflies, oftentimes, as soon as they emerge, again, the males will emerge first, and then as the females begin to emerge, oftentimes they'll emerge they will mate as soon as they have emerged right there on the rock or log or wherever they are. And then they'll fly off. They can live upwards of a week to 10 days. They can take in a little bit of fluids, and so they can live a little bit longer than mayflies. And they will have mated already, and then the female, when her eggs are ripened up, she will come back to the river and start laying her eggs. And so there's really only two forms that we imitate with a fly, and that's the female laying her eggs, and then the active nymph. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Here's a stonefly nymph. They can be easily identified by two long tails, two long antennae. They also have two pair of wing pads, or a pair of wing pads, or two wing pads. Some of them are kind of highly ornamented, like this one, with fun little M shapes on their head. Others aren't quite as fancy. Some of them have gills on the underside of them. Some of them don't have any gills at all, and they just take in oxygen right through their cuticles, their skin. Come in a variety of colors and sizes. The stonefly adult has two pair of pretty big wings, but when they're at rest, they completely fan fold these over them, and you when you look at them like this, it's hard to imagine, their wingspan, as it were. They always have, you can always see two long antenna. Some of them as adults also have tails, some of them do not. Some of them can be, a little bit colored up like this one. Some of them are more drab. In flight, to me, they kind of remind me of helicopters, partially because of the really big wings that they have. They're very fluttery in flight. Now, when they go to emerge, typically this happens under cover of darkness. And recall that when the mayfly emerged, it was very rapid, under, sometimes only in a few seconds. This, on the other hand, when a stonefly emerges, takes anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. And the bigger ones, this Pteronarcis, this is a big, some people call it a salmon fly. This took 45 minutes. And I've watched other stoneflies emerge that are smaller, but they're still very slow, and they take like 30 minutes. Sometimes people get confused, for example, with some of the winter stoneflies or little yellow sallies. I'm sure you've all fished with some of those. And they say, well, I've seen them emerging right on the water. And what happens is it definitely looks like that. And what will happen is, because it takes so long for them to emerge, if there's any kind of wind at all and they're blown off their substrate, then they get knocked into the water, and it looks, they might float down and around the bend, and somebody will be like, oh yeah, for sure, I saw this stonefly emerging in the water. And typically that's what happens. It's just that they get knocked off their substrate, and they can't speed the process up at all. They're just very slow to emerge. So in fishing a stonefly nymph, again, they're not going to be readily swimming up and down in the water column. They're going to be down, oftentimes with stoneflies, they're hanging out on submerged wood in leaf packs, and they're not going to really be active until right before they emerge. And because they have to crawl out to emerge, if you are savvy on the emergence time, the way to fish a stonefly nymph is, prior to an emergence, you want to really be out in the middle of the river and fishing to the bank, because all of those nymphs are migrating to the stream side, so that they're able to crawl up on rocks or logs or vegetation and then get ready to emerge. Now you're probably wondering, what in the world is that white nymph down there in the right-hand corner? It doesn't look like any stonefly I've seen. And with stoneflies, and actually with mayflies as well, every time, and someone said, well, what is a molt? So when they shed that skin, that exoskeleton, this is what they look like. And as they grow and develop, the wing pads will get bigger, the eyes will get bigger, everything gets bigger and bigger and more developed. They're as they right beforehand, their digestive systems will get decreased, prior to emerging. The wing pads will be fully developed, and so on. So you can watch them change. But when they shed that exoskeleton, they're super soft and bright white, and you can watch these, and it takes a long time for them to color up. It might be 24 hours before they get all of that brown color back in there. And so just for fun and for kind of a challenge, it would, tie up any of your patterns all in white like this, and see if you can't, especially at one of the drift times, right at dusk or dawn, fish one of these freshly molted patterns and see if you have any success. fish eat them because, I mean, obviously they're, super obvious to see, and it's kind of cool. Here's a stonefly female, and she has started to lay her eggs. She's already laid some of them. And this is kind of like a tube of toothpaste, just, getting used up, and the eggs keep coming and coming and coming. And if she doesn't get eaten and she's able to lay all of her eggs, eventually her entire abdomen will be completely rolled up and nothing left of her. So that's all in the adult stage of the females. It's just one big giant tube of eggs.
And
Yeah.
when the stonefly females drop their eggs, are they above the water or do they land on the water?
Well, so you can see it kind of looks like almost like a caviar. And so she has to kind of touch those in to the water to try to get, that amount or some little bit of that broken off, and that clump will then fall to the bottom. And then she'll keep squeezing more and more out of there.
So they have to get through, so she can get them through the meniscus?
Yes, yes. That's a really great question, because in some, so that's true of our stoneflies. Some of the mayflies, for example, in that Hendrickson, I showed you a big, like a ball. It looked like a little lantern. But other mayflies will actually hover over the surface and throw their eggs. Literally, they never come and meet the surface. And then still others, some of them, like with some of the blue-winged olives, they'll actually land and crawl down and lay their eggs. So there's a variety of strategies, and I try to outline that or lay that out in my book so that you kind of know which of those. So not everybody does it the same way is basically the case. And when we look at caddisflies, you'll find that's also true.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the main thing with that, when I fish stoneflies, because of the way she lays her eggs, I always dance I never just lay a stonefly out there, an egg-laying stonefly anyways, an egg-laying female. I am always dancing it around and trying to imitate the natural. Now, of course, when you fish out west, if you're fishing one of the really like the salmon fly, sometimes a natural will fall into the water after it's emerged, because they literally have, thousands of them laying in these bushes along a river. And so that's different. Those are freshly emerged stoneflies, and some of them are going to fall off as they're crawling around. But when you have a flying stonefly coming up and down into the river, that's going to be a female. And then you want to imitate that a little bit differently. Okay, so then our last group are the caddisflies. And this is the first group of aquatic bugs that we've seen that has a complete metamorphosis. And so when you go to the fly shop, you'll see caddis larva, and the larva means that, oh yeah, it's got a complete metamorphosis. And anything that has a larva, it basically looks like a grub with, some little kind of legs. And sure enough, that's what the caddisfly looks like. So the female will lay eggs, and what hatches out will look like a tiny little grub with some legs. And this is kind of an advanced group of insects. And there are some different branches in this group. The more primitive caddisflies are what we call free living. And what they do is they just crawl around on a rock, and they've got a pretty good set of mandibles, and they'll eat whatever they run into, and they're successful in that way. Some caddisflies will spin webs. Some of them, you can sit alongside a river and look down and actually see, they look like, if you know what an oriole's nest, I'm a kind of a big bird watcher in case you hadn't figured that out. They look like oriole nests hanging on all these little twigs under the water. And then each one of those little spun nests is a caddisfly, and they're living and collecting food. Some of those caddisflies will also build almost like a little cave, and it's a little duplex. And on one side they go and live, and then on the other side they've got a web, and they catch food in that web, and they come out of the duplex, they go over and feed, and then they go back in their little cave. And then yet others build these fancy cases, and these are the larvae that I think most of us are familiar with. Some of those cases are very fancy, made of twigs or little bits of gravel, sometimes out of shell, sometimes out of plant material. Many of them can the cases are mobile, and they can walk all over the stream with them. Others have cases that are completely fixed in place, and they don't move at all. So after about a year, they only molt 5 times. So they're quite a bit different than our stoneflies and mayflies. And then after a year, they have to make up some kind of pupal shelter. Those with cases oftentimes just seal them up and pupate inside, probably 2 to 2.5 weeks in there. And then it'll be radically changed. What you see there, the emerging pupae, it's kind of a, shrink wrapped version of the adult. And if you were to cut that out with, a super fine scalpel, the adult would actually pop out of there. So they're kind of just, they're completely transformed and then shrink wrapped into that little emerging pupae. Sometimes it's called a ferrate adult also. And then once that the adult gets to the surface there, they take off pretty quickly, fly off to some, surrounding vegetation and mate. No big fancy swarms for mating anyways. And then again, the female will return to the river, and after her eggs have ripened up, the caddis will live, upwards of a week or thereabouts, and sometimes a little longer. But then again, as anglers, we can imitate any of these different life cycle forms. I think, depending on the species, quite often the emerging pupa is the most important, but the way the caddis lay their eggs, some of them dip their eggs into, not unlike, a mayfly or stonefly, and dip their abdomens and dispense their eggs that way. But many of them will dive down underwater and lay their eggs. And so, you can take an adult form and put a little split shot on your tippet and sink that down if you have an egg laying caddis species, and imitate it that way. So a free living caddis, it just looks kind of like a grub, and you can up there in the upper left look and see that it's got some pretty good little chompers, nothing that could bite us, but could certainly grab a little chironomid, a little midge larva, and eat it. And they pretty much just kind of chomp on whatever they encounter. Many of our caddis have cases. This is a pycnopsyche, or stick caddis, some people call them. You can see some in the lower right, just some legs sticking out. And if you try to pry them out of here, it's pretty impossible. You'll probably kill them. They're pretty well, they know how to hang on in there. And they'll grow and change in there. Sometimes they have to add on to their case to provide for their growth. I include this slide just to show you a variety of cases, some of them using bits of sand and shells and plant material. And the lower left, the little Brachiocentris, where it actually has perfectly little symmetrical, like a little chimney. And we have lots of species of those. The one in the upper right included, I don't have a great picture of one of the webs yet underwater, but I have some new underwater cameras that I'm going to try to get some pictures of that this year. But I actually pulled that out of one of the webs, one of the little duplexes, as I like to call them. And that's one of the web spinners. I like this. This is a ferrate or a ferrate adult. So this is one of the things that's going to come out of the little pupa or cocoon and swim to the surface. And if you could, have a perfect little scalpel and take that little exoskeleton off, you would have an absolute perfect caddis adult in there. And what you're looking at their front and center are the wing pads, and they're just stuffed, just totally stuffed in those wing pads. And you can see on the abdomen shrubs of gills there, and of course the long antenna that once it's emerged, those will be out in front of it. So it's really kind of cool. I like to think of it as that super Amazon packaging where you buy a product and you get your razor blade out to get it out of there. And that's kind of like our caddis ferrates here. And so the caddis adult itself, when you catch one in your hand, you can always tell that you've had one. You open your hand, and when you catch a moth, you can see little scales or dust in there. And when you catch a caddis, there's little tiny hairs in there after it flies away. And if you see them in profile, their wings are held like a tent over their bodies. The wings actually extend quite a bit beyond their abdomen. So I know when we start tying, we always tie elk-hair caddis right to the end of the abdomen, but in reality, the wings go beyond there. Excuse me. As adults, they have a pair of long antennae. They don't have any tails as adults. And in all of the research that I have done, I was really surprised by how many emerging caddis have bright green abdomens. And so if you're a tyer and you're tying anything in an emergent pattern, I encourage you to have a lot of bright green emergent patterns. I know there are some cinnamon ones. There are fewer than there used to be because of the way our waters have changed. But as they age, the bodies get darker, and so the egg layers or the adult females, their bodies are darker. But just something kind of fun to file away. Those of you that are tyers, and it was interesting to me to note all of that. This is a slide just to, a lot of times we think of caddis kind of like that upper right corner, just kind of brown and boring, but many of the caddis have really beautiful wing patterns, and you can learn those. Some of them have extremely long antenna, like the one in the lower left, and the antenna actually extend beyond that slide. And then some of them, like the upper left, the antenna are not quite as long as the body. And those are helpful when you start really diving into them and learning different caddis species. And as I said, some of them lay their eggs on the surface, some dive below, and some of them actually lay their eggs, you know, on maybe emergent vegetation and rely on water or, you know, rain to drip their eggs in. So some different egg laying strategies there. Is there another question there, Jerry? No, okay. In fishing patterns, I mean, we don't think that fishing a case caddis, you know, can amount to anything, but there are different times of the year when there's, you know, when there are a lot of case caddis in the water, and maybe not a lot of other food where fish will preferentially feed on them. And it can be fun to imitate that and catch fish on a cased pattern. For me, the better thing to fish, and I always have a number of emergent patterns. Even a soft tackle is a good representation of an emerging caddis pattern. And you know, typically just fish them out straight out and then, you know, let them drift. And then as they naturally start to rise, that's exactly the way a caddis will swim to the surface. And typically you won't get a hit as you cast it out, and you'll get that hit as it swings around and then rises. And then, you know, dry fly caddis strategy, you know, typically, you know, we think, oh, elk hair caddis, elk cut caddis. Elk hair caddis are great for certain types of water. You know, you need some pretty good current to keep it buoyant and keep it up and off the water. But if you're on other waters that are more still, you have to, you know, change that strategy out and maybe have a no hackle pattern like the upper left. With that ribbon caddis, you know, if you're on some really, really slow water, you could even completely cut all the hackle off the bottom of that so it sits right very still, or even if those of you that like to tie with CDC, sometimes you need a pattern that's totally just very, very much right in the water film. I always have a lot of different colors and sizes of X caddis. I find them to just be enormously successful. I mean, they completely imitate an emerging caddis. When you think about that diagram that I showed you of the life cycle, where the emerging caddis is right there in the surface film, think of the wings as being the emergent part, and that abdomen and shuck as everything that it's trying to pop out of. And just a very, very successful pattern, very generic. And you can tie that in a number of different colors and sizes and have success. So I guess in conclusion, what I'd like to see you do is kind of make some of your own decisions, do a little research, a little studying, and stop relying so much on your fishing partner, who might not really know what he or she is talking about, and try to figure out some of it on your own so that you're not just a better fly fisher, but a better fly caster in the long run. So with that, I'm going to put my email up here. I think, yeah, if any of you, I really, really, really worked hard on this earlier in the year, and I thought I would have my second, it's not technically a second edition because I'm changing publishers, but I'm going to, you know, update this. And if you are interested, I'll send you a notice when I have it out in 2022. And I can also maybe just let Jerry know, and he can let club members know, but I will have it out, and it will be updated and have some all the terrestrials in it, and which I, you know, worked on this summer and have some pretty good photos.